morning, and thank you for coming. And thank you, Steve, for that very sweet and kind introduction. It means a lot to me. I'm going to start off with a little story that actually doesn't take place in Haiti. The beginning part doesn't take place in Haiti. But then we'll very quickly get into Haiti. Recently, I flew back to Port-au-Prince on Copa Airlines, a carrier based in Panama City. Most of the passengers were South American men, UN peacekeepers, returning from vacation or on their first deployment to Haiti. I sat next to one of them. There were a handful of Haitians too, and on my other side was a hefty woman, about 50 years old. She wore a nubby chartreuse suit that was smart, but maybe too warm for the weather. And she rummaged with pointy nails through her designer knockoff bag. We struck up a conversation about 20 minutes before landing, after she ordered me to put up my tray table. She had the stern mien of many Haitian women who, having decided that foreigners and men are useless, are accustomed to taking charge. So I obeyed. Then she ordered me to tell the peacekeeper to put up his tray table too. Her name, it turned out, was Madame Cassius, and she had spent 3 days in Panama City buying women's clothing and undergarments to bring back to Haiti. She'd bought what was for her a paltry amount, some $15,000 worth, to distribute to her network of wholesalers around Port-au-Prince. Haiti doesn't produce all that much. The so-called bright spots in its economy are mangoes on the agricultural side and t-shirts on the industrial side. And for a long time, the biggest engine of the economy has been buying imports and then reselling them. So I've heard about these importers, almost all of them women, from a friend who has a microfinance institution. Ripe with post-earthquake donations, the institution had made loans of about $50,000 apiece to a group of 32 women like Madame Cassius, who would journey to Panama and Brazil and as far afield as China to buy cheap goods to resell to Haitians. My friend said the loans were necessary because the earthquake had destroyed merchant stocks. Women all along the network of buyers and resellers needed to restock for the back-to-school season. The loans amounted to $1.6 million, and my friend worried about everything that could go wrong in their repayment. But Madame Cassius said she'd never taken a loan. She refused on principle. No pun intended. Actually, she probably refused on interest. Pre-earthquake, commercial rates were around 25%, and banks might have refused her a loan even if she had collateral. Instead, she had built up her business little by little over the course of 20 years, going from a retailer on the street to a sub-wholesaler to a wholesaler to finally one of the women that venture abroad to buy. What a find, I thought to myself. A successful businesswoman, one who had made her way up through the jungle of commerce in Port-au-Prince, who had less than a high school education, it turned out, spoke no Spanish or English, had raised 5 children, and who had covered whatever losses the earthquake had dealt her up and down her supply chain on her own. So I asked her how her trip went. Her eyes got wide and she said, "Oh, business is bad. It's awful. You must understand." She said the merchandise in Panama was of poor quality, out of date, or overpriced. Not only had she not bought very much, but in general, she wasn't making the trip to Panama as much as she used to. "And why is that?" I asked, anticipating an answer about the global economic crisis, or perhaps some terrible personal story about the earthquake. "It's because Jesus is coming," she said. "Everyone knows he's coming, and so they're not producing and bringing good things to market. They're retreating." She looked at me quizzically and said, "You knew that, didn't you?" I hadn't known that, actually. And I wondered at this cosmic certainty emanating from Madame Cassius. For months, billboards around Port-au-Prince had told residents the same thing in Creole. Jesus was supposed to arrive on May 21st, according to the billboards, but Madame Cassius knew better. She told me not even Jesus himself knows when he's coming. Only his Father, the good Lord, knows. That's a familiar phrase in Creole. C'est seul bon Dieu qui connaît. It's only the good Lord who knows. The phrase speaks to the great chasm between most Haitians and those who make the decisions, the sense that many Haitians quite reasonably have, that they don't control the direction of their nation or their environment. What I'd like to talk about today, though, is the idea of apocalypse floating around Haiti, end times, the fear of many Haitians that calamity is around the corner, even if they don't sign on to it with Madame Cassius's particular Pentecostal zeal. I think these quasi-apocalyptic fears reflect a long-standing, deep desire for change. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll suggest why the primary vehicle for change in Haiti, democracy, hasn't delivered. So I wish I could say that Haitians' anxiety and sense of decline were new, a result of last year's earthquake, or even the result of a global campaign about the rapture on May 21st. But it is not new. Countless times throughout my relatively peaceful tenure in Haiti, I was warned by well-meaning Haitians that things were sure to get hot or chaud on the streets and that I should take care. Burning tires, gunfire, looting, rock throwing, flaming barricades. Here are some of the things that Haitians feared would set it all off. The exclusion 2 years ago of former President Jean-Bertrand Aristide's party from Senate elections, a seemingly inexorable rise in food prices, the failure of a bill that would have increased the minimum daily wage from $1.75 to $5, the cutting off of food aid to 10 cities a few months after the earthquake, the 3-month extension of the term of the popular president, René Préval, the failure of Wyclef Jean, a Haitian hip-hop artist, to qualify for the presidential race, the fiasco of first-round voting in November's presidential election, during which probably hundreds of thousands of Haitians were disenfranchised. Wyclef himself called a press conference the next day to warn the assembled, befuddled journalists. This place is gonna burn unless somebody comes up with a solution in 2 days. By then, thank goodness, nobody was listening to Wyclef. Then, in January, the former dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier returned from 25-year exile. In March, Aristide returned too, after 7 years in South Africa. Each of these events were pegged by Haitians, rich, poor, or in the tiny middle class, as sparks that might light the tinder of their nation's discontent. And none of them did. So, to be fair to Haiti's chicken littles, the country has experienced periods of sustained disorder. The most recent ended 4 or 5 years ago. And for the poor, hypervigilance is easy to understand. Their lives are already precarious enough, and civil disorder can mean personal devastation. For the rich, I think fear of disorder and decline partly represents worry about property and investments. There may be some animus in it too, but I like to think that it's partly guilt. The vast visible gap between the poor majority and the tiny elite makes no moral sense. Not just Haitians worry. The US State Department's perennially overwrought travel warnings to Haiti typically urge Americans to avoid all non-essential travel there. I've never recognized the Haiti these warnings conjure. The constant violent protests, kidnappings, assaults. It sounds, in fact, like it's a country on fire. But actually, crime is low. Haiti's homicide rate, a good barometer for violent crime overall, is lower than that of the neighboring Dominican Republic and far lower than in Jamaica. Ideas about doom or degradation are written into the language, too. There's a Creole proverb, l'année passée toujours plus bon, which means last year was always better. It's yet another testament to the downward trajectory of Haiti's fortunes. It's a depressing adage in a way, but it's also artful. It's a reminder that things could get worse, a bit of wry commentary on the acts of complaining itself, even a rejoinder to a nostalgia that exists all around the world. In any case, I hope we're not saying last year was better, about 2010, the year inaugurated by an earthquake that razed the capital and crushed tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people to death. In the days that followed, I would hear people argue about whether the earthquake was the end of man or just the end of Haiti. It wasn't the end of anything. Next came 1 million people languishing under tents, the rainy season, which made sleep for tent dwellers impossible and had a frightening tendency besides to wash their shelters away, a cholera epidemic that killed 5,000, and to top it all off, a political crisis in which the ruling party, heretofore lame and lethargic, roared to life in an apparent attempt to steal the election. We made mirthless jokes about the year: earthquakes, floods, a plague that caused violent death. What was next? Locusts? No, actually, it was Sarah Palin. And a myriad of other celebrities that swarmed in, hoping in some way to use the beleaguered little country to burnish their images. 2010 was truly an awful year, and shortly after it ended, at 12:01 a.m. on January 1st of this year, Haitians came out of their tents and shacks and banged pots and pans and screamed and sang in exultation, and also to chase 2010's demons away. If only it were so easy. If only Haiti's excessive vulnerability to disaster and calamity were a fluke, a matter of a bad luck year. It is not. It is the result of long-standing forces that will not abate anytime soon. Let's return to Madame Cassius, the clothing importer. I used her to illustrate the doom, decline, and worry so prominent in the Haitian worldview. But perhaps I misrepresented her, because it turns out that her idea about the apocalypse is not just about the end of this world. It's also about the birth of a new one. So hers is not a nightmare, it's a utopian dream. And ultimately, Madame Cassius is less worried than welcoming. When I called her in Port-au-Prince a few days after our flight, she told me that I could find her at the Pentecostal revival. From 8 a.m. to noon, every day for 42 days, she would be at church. She urged me in that bossy tone that brooked no quibbling to convert, so that I would be ready when the Savior came. For me, Madame Cassius's dream and its envisioning of a perfect new world recalls rather more secular conversations that I've had with many Haitians. They told me that what Haiti needs is another revolution. They don't know how this perfect world is going to come about or when, but it needed to happen, so it must. Most seem sure that it wouldn't arrive through political participation. I was told over and over again that Haitians in the government were loyal only to their pockets, not to the people they ostensibly served. Even the overthrow of the current government wouldn't achieve the wholesale change they envisioned. Haiti had seen enough coups d'etat already, 33 in its relatively short history. I remember vividly a few dozen Haitians at a shelter rally in September, a couple of months before the election. It was a rare instance of earthquake victims trying to pressure the government to take action. They chanted, "We are not voting while living under tents." At first, this seemed exactly backward to me. Wasn't living under tents all the more reason to vote? In functioning democracies, after all, we would vote for someone who would get us out of tents. But in a broken democracy, the stance has a certain logic. If you really believe that your government exists to serve its members' interests and not yours, then they're using you. Voting is the gift of legitimation, not a delegation of duty. When they spoke about revolution, Haitians also singled out the international aid apparatus. At this point, the Republic of NGOs is all but synonymous with Haiti. Or they spoke against the occupation by the United Nations, whose peacekeepers have been in the country for the past 7 years. Others, to my surprise, took the opposite tack. They told me that for real revolution, Haiti didn't need less occupation, it needed more, specifically a foreigner in charge. The idea of revolution, whether biblical, political, or economic, has deep roots in Haiti. Haitians are heirs to a revolution that shocked the world, the only successful slave revolt in all of history, which resulted in 1804 in the island's independence from its French colonial masters and the creation of the world's first Black republic. After independence, Haiti's leaders tried to send the former slaves back to the plantations and to labor conditions that looked a lot like slavery. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Haitian intellectuals today use the same language to describe the coming of democracy to Haiti more than 20 years ago. The genie flew out of the bottle and there was no containing it, no going back to the old ways, dictatorship, political repression, torture. In fact, older democracy activists, those imprisoned for what they said on the radio or in newspapers, have complained to me that the press these days might be too free, that you can say whatever nonsense you like on the radio with no repercussions. A catalyzing event in the movement against Duvalier occurred in 1983, 3 years before his ouster. Pope John Paul II accorded Haiti a visit. The Duvaliers regarded this as a sign of papal support for their regime. The First Lady, who, incidentally, reserved a room in the palace for cold storage of her extensive fur collection, planned to tour the Pope around Port-au-Prince, visiting hospitals and cuddling the afflicted. But the Pope had something else in mind. He refused to leave the airport, where he kissed the tarmac and delivered a scathing indictment of Duvalierism that included the line, "Faut que ça change," this must change. But as confirmed by the moderate reception given to Baby Doc when he returned this year, not enough has changed. Few Haitians these days have much interest in prosecuting the dictator for crimes against humanity. And this passivity is only partly because the legal system has zero credibility. It's also a verdict on the past 25 years. The signal phrase of the democratic movement was coined by Aristide. Tout monde c'est monde. Every person is a person. It sounds obvious, but it meant a lot. And it didn't mean just political and civil rights. It signaled in economics premised on the equal dignity of each person, which meant redistribution, investment in public services like education, sanitation, and health. Most Haitians who were and are still poor loved the message, just as they'd loved the Pope for saying it years earlier. But it gave much of the tiny wealthy elite the shivers. In the political instability that preceded and followed Aristide's initial 7 months in office, investors fled. There was an embargo. There was an embargo. Businesses closed. The denuded land had stopped producing, and then rice tariffs were lowered, and Asian farmers couldn't compete with subsidized US rice. The capital swelled with migrants from the countryside. They had come to the city to chercher la vie, literally look for a life, but there were few jobs for them anymore. In 2004, Aristide was ousted again. By this time, the sheen had worn off his saintly reputation. He was tainted, tarnished, accused of doing some of the very things that Duvalier had done, arming supporters, rigging elections, having journalists assassinated. I'm not sure whether we'll ever know what he really did, at least not in the way we know what Baby Doc did. So when President Préval came to office in 2006, after 2 years of a repressive interim government, Haitians breathed a sigh of relief. Préval had leftist credentials. Aristide once called him my twin, but he was low-key. Aid started to flow again. Repression and ostentatious state arrogance ended. But as for policies that promote social welfare and justice, investment in services, fighting elite capture of government, and now foreign aid, the Préval government didn't do enough. Indeed, for his failure to connect with a largely poor electorate, for his failure even to speak publicly after the earthquake, he was reviled as imperious and aloof. Préval had become the symbol for an absent state. So today, Haitians still say, faut que ça change, this must change. They say, nous bouquet, we're fed up. One of the most prominent features of my Haitian landscape was the yearning for changement, far-reaching, system-wide change. So, initially, I thought that the earthquake might be Haiti's chance for a bloodless revolution, a kind of warless reset in which the deep-pocketed sympathy of the First World might translate to things like long-term investment in education, contracts for Haitian businesses, and an end somehow to the vicious cycle of aid apparatus domination and government incapacity. Perhaps this was magical thinking, but I wasn't alone. Talk and promises about building back better, creating a new Haiti, and not forsaking its people emanated from the likes of Bill Clinton, René Préval, and Barack Obama. One of my friends, a musician and voodoo priest, saw divine judgment in how the earthquake had destroyed bastions of officialdom, parliament, ministries, the National Palace, UN headquarters. Tectonic plate justice, I guess. It's an awful thing to say. So many people died when those buildings collapsed, many of them trying, in small and often frustrating ways, to make Haiti a better place. But the musician's words didn't come from cruelty. They reflected a feeling that had been building inside him for decades. This must change. My musician friend decided to join the presidential campaign of his cousin, Michel Martelly, another musician. Martelly's stage moniker was Sweet Mickey, and for a couple of decades, he called himself the president of compa, the music that provides an excuse for slow, close-danced merengue. My musician friend had once derided compa as bad karma music, so devoid of political content that it verged on the reactionary. In fact, he hadn't spoken to his cousin for 20 years. But for the election, he put aside his musical and political reservations and got on board. He figured that an outsider already well-known and liked by the populace stood the best chance of winning and of effecting change. Sweet Mickey was known for his stage antics. He swore, dressed in drag, and mooned the audience. When I saw him in concert for the first and likely only time, he was sartorially muted, wearing a white undershirt and a bandana. But he was raucous nonetheless. At one point, he told us, in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, none of this is going to be here. This club's going to be gone. The city's going to be gone. The country's going to be gone. We're going to be gone. So enjoy yourself while you can. Drink, dance, and most of all, have sex. The crowd went nuts, and Mickey went on to urge us, in language not fit for a Saturday morning meeting in Washington, to take our pleasure, preferably with him if we were women, while we still could. I guess I missed my chance. The next time I saw him was 3 weeks later, in August, at the headquarters of the Electoral Council. Sweet Mickey had become Michel Martelly, a bespoke suited man who was signing the papers to register as a presidential candidate. His promise, back in 1997, to dance nude on top of the palace where he elected president was presumably null and void. Originally, Martelly failed to win a spot in the second round of elections at all. He did so only after weeks of diplomatic pressure directed at the ruling party and the Electoral Council, both widely accused of fraud. US visas were revoked, Préval was threatened with exile, and most important, an Organization of American States report was leaked. It said that were the most egregiously fraudulent results removed, Martelly would have edged out the government candidate. The report's methodology wasn't statistically kosher, but at that point, very little of the election made procedural sense. Indeed, the day after the first round of voting was one of my saddest in Haiti. Polling station after polling station was filled with Haitians who couldn't find their names on the list of voters, though they easily located the names of dead relatives and friends. It's a zombie election, one of them told me. Buses and taxis weren't allowed on the street on election day, so after walking to 5 or 6 stations in search of their names, many would-be voters simply gave up and went home. In addition, hundreds of thousands of voters in an electorate of only 4.5 million didn't get their ID cards in time to vote. At another polling station, hundreds waited in vain for the correct ballots to arrive. A well-dressed woman was venting to an election monitor there. After visiting 3 polling stations, she'd finally found the right one, she said, and I still can't vote. She turned around and saw me, and her scowl lifted into a smile. Yes, I have that effect on people. No, actually, we knew each other from the time, a few months earlier, when I'd driven my car into a giant hole in front of her house and she'd driven me out. I owed her a ride home when we talked as I drove her there. And she argued that neither the government nor the international community really wanted Haitians to vote. The election proved it. I asked her, what if they're just incompetent? She said, that's even worse. There were calls for a do-over. In fact, even before polls closed, Martelly and 11 other candidates called for the election's annulment. Martelly changed his tune very quickly once initial returns showed him doing well. But the international community, which footed most of the $26 million bill, wasn't so keen on that. The show went on slowly and procedurally perverse, and Martelly won the second round overwhelmingly. Turnout in both rounds was around 23%. The figure underscores the disenchantment that many Haitians feel about the democratic process. Martelly is popular, no doubt. Throughout the campaign, he turned his utter lack of political experience into a huge asset. Haiti's 25 years of failure? Not his fault. And unlike other contenders, Martelly spoke the dialect of the Haitian street, with all its musicality, wit, and force. When I left Haiti a couple of days after his inauguration, there was a sense of hope floating about. 3 weeks in, though we don't know what the Martelly presidency will bring, leftists fear that he will chip away at Haitian civil and political rights. He's spoken about bringing back the army, which Aristide abolished in 1995, and he said he is open to granting amnesty to Jean-Claude Duvalier, who is currently under investigation for crimes against humanity and corruption. Some of his prominent advisors are Duvalieristes. So I sympathize reflexively with those on the left. At the same time, when people talk about the left in Haiti, I have no idea what they mean. Was René Préval progressive? He was supposed to be. He got some roads built, presided over stability, and released political prisoners. But he also sided with textile manufacturers over a minimum wage increase, gave more than a few sweetheart deals to his friends, and oversaw massive vote rigging. And at this point in Haiti, there is so little public wealth that the familiar left-right divide, at least the one that's familiar to me, between social services investment and redistribution on the one hand, and lower taxes and ease for businesses on the other, makes little sense. Still, when Martelly took office, it was only the third time that Haiti had seen a peaceful democratic transition. It was the first time that an incumbent president had passed the presidential sash. Yes, it's a sash, onto a member of the opposition. This is a big deal, and it's certainly a better deal than another interim government or a coup. But with the low turnout, the international community's heavy hand, and the numerous violations of process we all saw, Martelly is hardly the standard bearer for a functional democracy. I also harbor serious doubts about what he could do. He's a populist who wanted his personality. He will be confronted with an opposition-controlled legislature. Martelly's constituency, importantly, includes donor states. Only about 30% of Haiti's government budget comes from international sources, the rest from donors. So I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but Martelly wouldn't have been found anywhere near the National Palace, dancing nude or otherwise, were he not suitable for, and perhaps considered pliant by, the international community. I share the doubts of Haitians all along class lines about the idea that a populist election can remedy decades of institutional degradation, lack of education, and economic decline. A Haitian civic leader I interviewed recently saw the political season as yet another sad episode in her country's history. Her outlook was grim, but she was eloquent, so I'll quote her prognosis for Haiti's political future. You're going to keep having these populist elections that go nowhere in this endless tragedy, this tragedy that keeps repeating itself. It's like you have this macabre leader laughing at us as politics do not take us out of this cycle. The macabre laughter that she heard was that of Francois Pavadoc Duvalier, dead 40 years now. So, how does Haiti get better? If I had a magic wand and 3 wishes, this is how I would spend them. First, I would go back in time, and since it's a magic wand, I can go back in time, and ensure that the 2010 election were fair and more transparent. The international community should have invested more resources and oversight into ensuring their smooth functioning. Many problems were foreseen and plenty of time to solve them. In particular, a June report by Senator Dick Lugar warned of looming disaster. Unless certain political parties were included, voting card distribution was sped up, and people knew where to vote. None of this happened. Throughout the election season, the UN and the United States would issue press releases congratulating Haiti on the success of its democratic process. These attempts to paper over the election struck me as hypocritical, distasteful. They added grist to the mill, too, of Haitians' democratic discontent. A zombie election, they said. One put on for the international community. I think that Haiti's is a Potemkin democracy at this point. Anyway, as a corollary to wish number 1, we're doing the election, I want these awful double-talking press releases to stop. Second, I would make long-term, systematic, committed investments in education. To rebuild a country, you need a middle class. For a middle class, you need education. Haiti also needs regeneration of its intellectual leadership. This is not an easy task. You can't even earn an undergraduate degree in history in Haiti. Most prominent Haitians in my generation work at the family business or at NGOs. They are not newspaper editors, radio commentators, civil servants, political leaders, or policy advisors. Well before the earthquake, Bill Clinton brought down about 100 investors to Haiti. The efforts and buzz surrounding investment continued, and undoubtedly, investment and job creation are very important to Haiti. But without education, Haitians will be forever confined to jobs that keep them at or below survival level. Education is tricky in a country like Haiti, heavily dependent on foreign aid. Aid agencies and banks typically lack the incentives to make long-term investments whose returns will not be reaped for decades. The Haitians do not elect these de facto policymakers. They don't even know who they are. This brings me to my third and final wish. Haitians need aid agency accountability. As a first step, the government should register all the NGOs in the country. Estimates of their number before the earthquake ranged up to 10,000, though the Haitian ministry in charge of coordinating and directing them had counted only 400. Since the earthquake, the number of NGOs and would-be do-gooders has swelled beyond belief. But that registering and counting is just the initial step in a very thorny problem. For Haiti is stuck in a vicious cycle, and it has been for a while. The government can always excuse itself by claiming, often with reason, that it has no money or resources to implement its plans. Donors and aid agencies can always blame the government for corruption or lack of capacity or laziness, again, often with reason. It's one of the best cover-your-ass mechanisms I've ever seen. But it leaves Haitians in a quandary. They don't know who their policymakers are. They don't know whom to hold accountable. It's nobody's fault, and it's everybody's fault. Political action begins to feel futile. One of the perverse results is that some Haitians, heirs to a revolution that cast off slavery forever, start yearning for occupation again. They imagine that at least then they would know who is in charge. So those are my 3 wishes for Haiti: fair elections, education, and accountability. Granting them will not stave off another earthquake, and they won't stave off the apocalypse. But if fulfilled, they would constitute a lasting revolution.